been a VC now for 30 years, over 30 years. How do you wake up excited every day?
Well, you know this because you're a VC as well. There's no end to the ingenuity and creativity of founders. And, when you think you've seen it all, then something, comes in your inbox or, comes across your desk somehow that's just completely out of left field that you've never thought of before. And it just, sucks you right in. So I think it's because founders are super creative and they come up with really interesting ideas for companies. And I'm a curious person. And, I just tend to be drawn to things I don't know that well. And I just, I get caught up in things. So the business kind of works for me in that way.
And so have you gone through lulls or periods where you've been searching for what's exciting, and what's exciting to you now?
Yeah, I've gone through, particularly in the last 10 years, I've gone through a couple of periods where I wondered whether or not I had, the enthusiasm for the venture capital business. And I've come to realize that happens to me when I get overcommitted. And it's actually not the business, and it's not lack of interesting opportunities. It's when I have too much on my plate and I become overwhelmed, then I'm not open to the new things that are coming in, and I don't have the ability to engage with them, and that's when the business becomes hard for me. So what I've done, frankly, over the last 5+ years is figured out how to take on less and maybe be able to do more. We can talk about that if you want. And that's helped me a lot. In terms of what's interesting to me, it's some of the same things that have always been interesting to me, and also some new things that have become more interesting to me. But, I'm interested in education. I'm interested in health and wellness. I'm interested in crypto. I'm interested in energy and climate and other things too. But those are 4 areas that are front and center for me.
Yes, so I'd love to hear about when you're overwhelmed, getting excited is hard. I have the same thing. I'd love to figure out how did you sort that out?
To be honest, I am not sitting on as many boards. What I have come to realize is that I don't need to sit on the board of every company of every investment that I lead for USV, and that I can be as helpful to a founder as a board observer than as a board member. And increasingly what I've been interested in doing is, instead of taking a board seat, I've encouraged founder to put on an independent director instead, usually a peer CEO who has gone through or is going through a lot of similar experiences, ideally somebody who brings some diversity to the board, diversity of experience, diversity, in other ways too, which I think is super important. And so it means that I'm now sitting on less boards than I've sat on in 20 years probably, and yet I'm working on more companies right now than I probably worked on in a decade. And that's been great for me. Shri, you still there? Shri, you're muted.
All right, Jonathan, I think you were taking over.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Fred. We'll just move on to the next one. So how do you think the VC market has been and will be remade because of COVID? So, specifically, we're interested in, what changes you expect in the next 5 years. And it looks like Shree's coming back.
Hey, Shree, you back?
Yes, I'm back. I'm trying to mute on 2 devices because I'm trying to juggle my internet issues. But yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Well, look, there's a couple things that are happening because of COVID that are interesting. One is that there's a whole bunch of new ways of working and ways of being that we've been introduced to in this moment. And I think that that will open up new areas of investment that are interesting to me, and I think to maybe many founders. But then there's also the way that venture capitalists work that is changing. Before the pandemic, I think out of maybe 100 investments, we only made 3 investments in companies with founders who we had never met in person. Now we've probably done that 6 more times. So where it was a very unusual thing for us to do that in the past, it's become normal for us to do that. And I think that we will continue to do that. I'm not saying that default behavior, but I think that we now realize that we can do that and there are other ways to get comfortable. And so that I think means that we could, I'm not saying we will, but it means that we could radically increase the geographic scope of what we might invest in. Today, we typically limit our investment to places that we can get to on, 6 to 8 hour flight. So the West Coast, I'm thinking, we're based in New York, so I'm thinking from New York, the West Coast, certainly most parts of Canada, some parts of Latin America and Western Europe has been, our geographic focus. But there's no reason if we can back founders without meeting them and potentially engage with them without getting on a plane and flying to, South Asia or Africa, we could potentially make investments there. Again, I'm not saying that USV will, but I think I'm just trying to make the point that what may happen as a result of the pandemic is that venture capital may become a much more global kind of thing. It is a global thing, but it's globally local, and there's a chance it could be globally global. So that's another thing that I'm interested in watching and seeing if that's what happens.
Yeah, Fred, you wrote last week that about CEO reviews and how important they are. And in a more global market where you may meet the CEO only once a year, because you are willing to travel, hopefully once this is over, how do you do that? And a follow-up is, when should a CEO start to seek that kind of a review?
Well, so I think there's 2 questions there. I think a CEO should look for that kind of feedback as soon as they possibly can get it. And what I believe is that a founder should create a board as soon as they create their company. And they should, I think what they should do is they should have a 3-person board, and it should be them and 2 independent directors who are independent, not their friends, not their family, but 2 independent people whose opinions they respect. And that those 2 people would then become their board and the people that they're accountable to and the people who review them on some regular basis. So I think it should happen right away. And then as it relates to this global question, it gets back to my point. If we were to invest in a company in Africa, for example, I think the right answer would be for us to find independent directors for that company that are local, and that we would be observers and maybe travel once a year or twice a year to attend a meeting or two in person, but that we would not be on the board of that company, that the board would be, people who are closer to the situation and can be, closer to that team and that founder. And so that, I think is a model that, we in the venture business think we need to be on a board so that we can have some ability to control, or control is too strong of a word, but to exert influence on the company. And I understand that. And I've engaged in that activity for as you mentioned, over 30 years now. The truth is we actually have influence over the companies because we are going to be sources of capital for those companies in the follow-on rounds of financing. And that leverage gives us a lot of influence. And, sitting on the board, if we can be a very valuable and engaged board member is great. But if we can't be, then we're just taking a seat that should go to somebody else. And there are other ways to have the influence that we want to have. So I've really come 180 degrees on this, and I really think that venture capitalists shouldn't necessarily be demanding board seats in the companies they invest in.
How do you, Fred, when you are on the board, or even if you're an observer, what do you see as the telltale signs of a company that's doing well and a company perhaps that's not doing well? When do you get the sign that, oh wow, okay, things are changing, I need to jump in, I need to give the person some advice? What are those indications that you've seen?
Well, I'll start with the management team. So if you have a high functioning management team, which to me means that you have a group of people who respect each other, who work well together and are coordinated and aligned in their efforts, that's a very strong sign that the company is being run well by the CEO. And if you don't have that, then I think it's a sign that the company's not being well run by the CEO. But that's just one sign. A second sign is the company putting out the work on a regular basis that the company needs to be doing? And that could be product, shipping product, that could be marketing, that could be hiring. It's just a whole, whatever those things are that the company's, got on its roadmap that it needs to be doing. Are they delivering on those goals? Are they meeting their objectives on a regular basis? So that's a second sign. And then there's also the financial performance of the company. Are they managing to their budget? Are they bringing in the revenues as they expect to, and those sorts of things? I don't think that the financial performance should be the most important signal. It is a signal, but it shouldn't be the most important signal. I actually think that the highly functioning management team is probably the highest signal. And the thing to me that's undone more CEOs than anything else I've seen in my career is a revolving door management team, where the senior leadership team is just never sticks around. And it could be that the CEO is removing those people, but it doesn't even matter whether they're being removed or they're leaving of their own volition. If you have too much churn at the senior level of a company, it's a sign something's not working right.
What do you as the board member, where do you see your role? How can you be most helpful when you see something like that? Is it already a lost cause if you're seeing that, or do you jump in with some very direct feedback?
Well, I've learned over the years that I have to jump in with very direct feedback, and it's better to identify the problem early on when you have the ability to help the CEO or founder or both figure out what's not working, get them a coach, help them get them a coach, encourage them to get a coach, whatever the right way to put that is, and understand that they're only going to go as far as their team can take them, and that's really their primary job. So yeah, and what I found is that it's better to have a relationship with a founder that is supportive, and that the feedback comes, more like, hey, I don't think this is going so well. Like, how do you feel about it? Let's talk about it, as opposed to, you got a problem here. Like, I think if you just like come in with sort of a negative attitude and sort of put them on their heels, it's not great. But if you come in saying, hey, this doesn't feel great. Like, how are you feeling about it? Then I think they're more likely to open up and not feel that defensive. The truth of the matter is that the VC founder relationship is a loaded relationship. As I said, they're relying on you to write the next check, and they're, probably afraid that if they screw up, you won't. And so they're probably not willing to kind of come clean that they're struggling with their leadership team. And so if you come at it, and put it on the table and do it in a sort of supportive way, I think that's the best chance you're going to have of creating a good relationship. But it's not an easy one. You know what I'm talking about, because you live it every day too.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of founders, just like there are all kinds of VCs, right? And we all bring our history and our baggage into the relationship. And you've probably seen founders, Fred, who think of the VC as a pain versus a collaborator and someone to help you. And do you invest in companies when you get that vibe, or or do you say, listen, life's too short. I want to have a great relationship with the founders I invest in. I certainly don't want to run their companies, but they might have been burned before. I'm walking away. How do you think about that?
Well, if I really want to invest in the company and I have a feeling that the founder doesn't want to have that kind of relationship, I generally put it on the table as an issue during the, financing process, and say, hey, I get the vibe that, you're really looking for money here, but you're not really looking for, a partner to help you build the business. And I'm curious why that is. And, if that's the case, I'm probably not the right investor for you. And maybe you'd be better off with somebody who's going to be more passive. And that'll at least bring out the conversation, and they'll have a conversation about it. But yeah, it's true. Some founders, don't want that relationship. In some cases, they don't even need that relationship. And so, I would be okay with a founder who is highly self-sufficient and can be successful without a lot of support. But what I would struggle with is somebody who is sort of openly hostile to, the idea that, you've got investors and they have certain, role to play, and that has to be respected. So there's a fine line between the two. And I have had some very successful investments over the years with founders who were very self-sufficient. And I felt like, in many ways, I was just along for the ride, and they weren't really very interested in my input. But it was okay, because we sort of learned to work together anyway. But when it's got, sort of an edge to it, it can become problematic.
Yeah. And talk to me a little bit about, you've invested early, you've invested a little bit later, all still early stage, but talk to me about a founder you've worked with from the C to the A, who you've seen just scale and be able to scale through, let's say, perhaps even going public or through the later stages. What are the key characteristics of a founder like that? And what do you encourage? We have a lot of early stage founders here. What do you encourage them to do and to be open to in order to keep scaling?
Well, one of my favorite examples of this is actually a founder that I didn't work with directly. My partner Albert worked directly with, and that's Jeff Lawson at Twilio. And it's just amazing to watch how much Jeff has grown over the past, I don't know, decade, maybe a little bit more now. I think Jeff was very self-aware of what he was good at and what he wasn't good at. And he made an effort to work on the things that he wasn't as good at, or surround himself with people who were good at those things. And it's, if you talk to Jeff and you get him really, thoughtful on the topic, I think he would tell you that it's not an easy journey, right? Because you have, you have to, at some point, figure out how to get the right team in place, and almost inevitably, as you're building a company, you're gonna hire the wrong people, and you're gonna have to deal with that, and that's can be very challenging, and so what I would say, just kind of thinking about every founder who I've watched, go for a very long period of time and stay in the CEO job and develop into a really strong leader of a very large organization, it requires a lot of work, usually with a coach or a series of coaches, and a lot of hard feedback and a willingness to, take the feedback and even if you don't totally agree with it, but understand where it's coming from and work on your own personal development. I don't think anybody is like a natural. I really don't. I think it's just a process that you got to work on it. So, people who get defensive about these things have a hard time getting better, and people who are self-confident enough and self-aware enough that are willing to, look at themselves and figure out what they need to work on generally do better.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because even when at the earliest stages, if a founder is struggling, if they can recognize that and ask for help, you're going to end up in a much better place than if they are just like, you know what, I got this. Don't talk to me.
Right. I also think finding the right management team, you need to be surrounded with people whose personality type and the way they act and behave line up well with you, right? So it's not all about skill set, it's a lot about chemistry, and it's not just chemistry between the leader and the individual executives, but among the team. It's really hard to get a great leadership team in place, but when you do, it's a thing of beauty. You've probably been on one or two in your career, and you know what I'm talking about. It's just like, oh my God, it's like being in a good relationship. I didn't realize it could be like this, and then, something happens, company gets sold or whatever, and you move on and you're like, damn, that was the best managed team I was ever on, or something like that,
Yeah, when you have the right people in the right roles and it's all working, it's such a joy to watch. And that's when you really can say it's kind of running itself, and you can give a suggestion or two, but the CEO is just, yeah, it's amazing.
Well, it lets the CEO go up a level and start thinking about what do I want to do with this company? Where do I want to take it? What are the new things I want? What are the new products I want to build? Or, how do I want to scale the organization or whatever? But if you're stuck in the operational stuff all day long, you can never get there. So that's what a really great team can do, is they can let the CEO go up, and start looking up above, their computer.
Totally agree. Fred, a little bit of a pivot. A lot of people look at China as kind of the frontier of futuristic technology, not just in payments, but, just in the integration that they can do, in the innovation that's coming out of China. How do you think about, do you spend time looking at China? What can US investors and founders learn from the tech that's coming there? And how can we do that?
So China's a little bit of a blind spot for me, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I recognize that really when you talk about technology, the US and China are the two big global superpowers. And it's not, by the way, to dismiss anything that's going on in other parts of the world, because there's lots of interesting things going on in other parts of the world. But in terms of critical mass, I would say US and China are far ahead of everybody else. And it's two very different models. You have to really respect what they've done in China. I mean, they commit to something and they just do it. And so, they have us in a bunch of key areas. Machine learning is probably the one that I think a lot of people are most concerned about, how strong they've become. But it's also true, like in, energy, technology, and a bunch of areas. So I think that those of us who are entrepreneurs and investors in tech in the West, obviously we need to be watching what's going on in China. We have chosen not to invest in China because I've always believed that it's a little bit of an insider's game, and you kind of got to be there and you kind of got to know how it's done to be good at it. And we are not that, so we've avoided it. But that also means we have a blind spot.
Yeah, we don't invest there for much of the same reasons. And also it just feels like, you're thriving one day and next day someone decides, oh no, you're not, and you're done. But okay, that's useful. Thank you. Fred, two more questions before I will open it up to the audience. One is, USV is a thesis-driven investing firm. I love that, and we try to do that as well. What does that mean? And what should a founder take away from a statement like that when a VC firm makes that statement?
Well, it's a recognition of a couple things, which is we need a guiding set of principles on our side that help us focus on a few areas and be as good as we can in those areas. It also is a recognition that founders have lots of options for capital, and in order to be attractive to a founder, you need to be strong in an area, right? So by us articulating a thesis and saying, these are the things we want to invest in, it focuses us, and we can just not worry about all the other things that don't line up against our thesis. But it's also, I think, a calling card to founders, because if they are working on something that is in our thesis, then they hopefully will feel like we are going to give them serious consideration, in their financing round, and that we will have some good insights into their business. And so that's where it comes from. And then, you know, the other thing is that we don't believe in a static thesis. We try to kind of redo it every 3 or 4 years. But along the way, you know, we will make some modifications. So if you look at our current thesis that's on our website, we call it Thesis 3.0, doesn't really mention climate. And yet we've been starting to invest in climate. So at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to reconcile those two things. It probably means that there's going to be a new thesis coming from us at some point in the next year or two. So we have enough, I guess, flexibility in our culture that allows us to evolve where we're going, but it does also focus us.
Got it. Thank you. That's super useful. And the next speaker is going to be my partner, Mark Tarpening, who co-founded Tesla and focuses on our sustainability investment. So we are aligned. And Fred, final question to you before I hand off. You know, you've talked about diversities on boards and, like, you know, perhaps white male investors not taking board seats, letting others take board seats. We are in a moment in time, and hopefully it's more than a moment, where hopefully we'll address some of the real issues that we have in our country. How do you think about diversity within the USV team, within the portfolio? And are there any changes or commitments you've made since the most recent Black Lives Matter protests?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think where we are with racial diversity is kind of where we are now with that. It's kind of where we were with gender diversity. When I say we, I'm talking about USV, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when we just realized that the way we were doing things wasn't the right way and we needed to change. And we didn't really go out and make a big public statement about it, but we committed ourselves internally to prioritize gender diversity in our hiring practices. And if you look at who we've hired over the past 6 or 7 years, it's almost, and hired's not the perfect term, because when you bring a new partner into a venture firm, you're not really hiring them. I don't know, feel like almost like you're inviting them or something.
Right.
But it's been almost all women, you know, up and down all of the ranks. And so that's been good for us. I think it's led us to a bunch of investments that we maybe wouldn't have made had we not done that. And I think it's been good for our culture. And so we are at a very similar place now with race and ethnicity. And, you know, I'm hoping that we'll make a very similar adjustment in our hiring practices. It's not like we don't have anybody of color in our firm, but we don't have anybody at the partner level. So in many ways, it's like we don't have anybody. Meaning that if you have a lot of diversity in your firm, but all the partners are white men, then you're not a diverse firm. It's just, I think I'll just be obvious about that, right? So until we can have diversity of all types at our partner level in our firm, we don't have enough diversity. So we have to fix that, and we're committed to fix that. And the way we did it, you know, when we were really focused on gender diversity, is that we approached it from multiple levels. It wasn't just in our hiring practices, but it was also in the kinds of investments we went after, the kind of founders we backed, the kind of board members that we invited onto our boards. And that was super helpful because, as I'm sure you realize, when you bring somebody into your partnership, it's usually somebody you've worked with before. it's very rare that you would bring somebody into your partnership that you never met before. And so in order to get more racial and ethnic diversity in our partnership, we need more ethnic and racial diversity in everything we do. And then that will naturally create the right connections and relationships to allow us to change our partnership. And so we have like 12 different work streams going on at USV right now around around this particular issue. And we're just throwing a lot of energy at a bunch of things instead of just one thing. And we're committed to it in the sense that we report on it every week in our weekly team meetings. And you know, I'm confident that we will make the changes that we need to make inside our firm. But it's also the case that it's going to take some time because, you know, we don't add a bunch of partners very often. So, you know, it has to just kind of happen on a cadence, but I'm pretty confident that we will make the changes we need to make in roughly the same amount of time that it took us to make meaningful changes with respect to gender diversity, maybe even more quickly, possibly.
Thank you, Fred. You know, one of the things, as I mentioned, I admire so many things about you, but one of the things is you're just so honest and direct about, you know, where the firm or, you know, whatever you're talking about may need work. And you are also, you know, not out there promoting things before you do the work. You just believe in doing the work, and that will lead to good things. I really appreciate that point of view greatly. So thank you. And at this time, I'm gonna jump in and ask our live audience to ask some questions. So audience, if you haven't asked your question, now's the time to drop your question into the chat to ask Fred. And here's how it's gonna work. We will privately chat you, and then I will call your name out. And at that time, I request that you unmute yourself and turn on your video so that you can ask your question live. All right, so the first question is going to be from Irina. Irina Pozlovsky, could you please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Fred. So my question is regarding why did USV invest in social networks in the past? For example, USV invested into Foursquare. What moved you to invest in that space and in that particular company?
Well, hi. It's nice to hear from you. We back in 2005 to 2010, were quite interested in social networks. It was a primary part of our investment thesis. And when the iPhone came along, we looked at, you know, what were new capabilities that a phone provided that a desktop computer didn't have. And one of them was knowing where you were. Not the only one, but one of them was knowing where you were. And so we were quite intrigued with the idea of a social network that knew where you were and could connect you to places and people that had similar interests. It turned out Foursquare kind of morphed into something very different. So that's not really what they are anymore, but that's why we made the investment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, question from Mio Yamamoto. Mio, would you unmute, please?
Hi, yep. Thank you, Fred, for the dialogue. My question is, what is the most important role of independent board of directors?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the most important thing that independent directors can do is represent the interests of the company. So I want to just tease out that a little bit. So, of course, everybody's interested in what's best for the company. But the truth of the matter is that investors are also going to be interested in what's in their best interests. and the founders are going to be interested in what's in their best interests. And oftentimes that might not be exactly the same thing that's in the company's interests. And so the beauty of an independent director, if they do their job well, is they're going to just be objective enough to say, okay, I hear what the investors are arguing for, and I hear what the founders are arguing for, but what's actually best for the company? And because they are in that role and they're incentivized to be in that role, they can do a lot of really good and helpful things by taking that perspective in their work on the board.
Thanks, Fred. The next question is from Craig. Craig, are you there? And can you unmute Craig Zelizer? Okay, if not, I'll ask Craig's question. When would you recommend founders focus on bootstrapping and growing revenue organically, if possible? And what are the cons of taking on venture money?
Well, look, I'm a big fan of bootstrapping in general. I think that it creates a very good sort of discipline inside a company of being able to generate revenue and use that revenue to fund the hires and the investment that you need to make. So I would encourage founders to think about bootstrapping as much as possible. And bootstrapping doesn't only mean, true bootstrapping, meaning getting a company off the ground without any outside capital. But I would also say it means extending your runway from your seed to your Series A, your Series A to Series B for a much longer period of time than would otherwise be possible, because you have this bootstrapping mentality of where you're using your revenue to fund the business as much as outside capital to fund the business. I think it's, just generally speaking, a very good mindset. Now, there are times when it doesn't make sense, and certain companies, just by way of how they're built and how they are architected, are going to need, or the products they're building and taking to market are just going to need to raise a lot of capital, and there's just no way to bootstrap them. So I'm not saying it's for everybody, but our most successful investment, I think, in many ways that we ever made at USV is a company called Indeed. Most people are probably familiar with their job search. And the two founders bootstrapped that company for almost 2 years before they raised outside capital. We have an education company called Quizlet that bootstrapped for 7 or 8 years before raising outside capital. That's also a very good company. So there are a lot of examples in my career of companies, of founders who built really good companies that ultimately raised capital, but bootstrap their way into the market. And so, if you can figure out a way to do that, I think it's something that you really ought to consider.
Yeah, I agree. And, there was a comment where it's harder for some companies, right, where you're in climate or hardware and there's real money needed. But on the software side, especially if you happen to be an engineer, it gets much easier for you to do that.
Right. Or in the case of the Indeed founders, they had a small success that had gotten them a little bit of money, and they reinvested their proceeds from that exit into Indeed, which allowed them to wait a long time to raise capital. So it's another example of bootstrapping. I mean, bootstrapping is, to me, it's more sort of a mindset than it is a particular technique.
The next question comes from Fisk. Do we have, can you unmute? I don't know if that's a man or a woman, Fisk. If not, I'll ask the question. Okay, so the most leading edge new business today is virtual, global, progressive, and self-organizing. while governments, which we already thought were hopelessly outmoded and out of date 30 years ago, are not. How do you see the world evolving?
That's a pretty heady question. You know, I think that there's a role for both the private sector and the public sector. So I'm not of the view that government is irrelevant, but I do think that if you really want to change the world, starting a business can be the most powerful way to do that. I mean, the classic example is in your video, you had, I think you started with Elon Musk and you know what he's done with battery technology and EVs is amazing because he kind of proved that there was a market there when a lot of people didn't believe there was. And now you have most of the major car companies making EVs, which maybe wouldn't happen as quickly. So I do think that entrepreneurship can move markets and move society faster than governments can.
All right, our next question is from Rami. Rami, are you there? There you go, Rami. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, hi. So thank you for taking my question. My question is, how do you recommend seed and early stage companies to reach out to VC they don't have any contact with, in essence, cold outreach?
Yeah, cold outreach is rough. So I think that you need some sort of angle of attack, you know, and the best one is through networks, right? If you know somebody who knows somebody who knows me, then that's a great way to get to me. But if you don't, another thing would be, you know, to try to figure out some hook that, you know, can get me to pay attention to your email or something like that. An example of that, when I got into the venture capital business back in the mid '80s, I went and found every venture capitalist who went to the same school that I went to. And I emailed them and said, oh, hey, I saw that you went to XYZ school. I just graduated from them, you know, and I got a higher hit rate. Back then there wasn't email. I was literally writing letters. I mean, if you can believe that, but I got a higher hit rate. So it's like, you got to find you got to get creative and you got to find some hook. You got to find some angle. And that's just the sad reality of it is that you got to figure out how to get noticed. And that's also in some ways what it is starting a company. You got to get noticed by the media. You got to get noticed by people you want to hire. You got to get noticed by investors. Like it is actually, it is something that entrepreneurs have to figure out how to do in many dimensions. And so some people don't like doing that and other people do like doing that. And I think everybody who wants to be an entrepreneur is going to have to figure out how to do it successfully, whether they like to or not.
Thanks, Fred. By the way, just so all of you know, Fred is very easily accessible. He puts his website, his email contact on his blog, and it's very easy to get a hold of him. The key is he probably gets 1,000 emails a day. So how do you stand out, even if you cold email him? But there are a lot of investors who will say, reach out to me through a warm intro, and Fred is not one of those people, and neither are we. And so, you know, for those people who are more open, it is worth trying to reach out to them and trying to stand out, but it's worth also recognizing that there's just a flood in the inbox. The next question comes from Greg. Greg, are you there? Could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. Hi, Fred. I'm Greg Zen from Startup Heroics. I'm a longtime fan. I just have a question about NoCode. Are you aware if NoCode is something that's becoming like the new darling in VC That's kind of a rumor that's going around, or is it just a rumor?
I'm not a proponent of the idea that that there are like hot categories and not hot categories. There are some people in the venture business who try to chase the latest shiny new thing, but I think that's actually a big minority. I think most people in the venture business have, a playbook that they're running, and they've been running it for a year or two or three or four. And so, I mean, no code is a thing in tech, and, there's some interesting companies working in it, but I wouldn't say that it's like where everybody's trying to make investments right now.
The next question comes from Roy. Roy, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Will do. Hi, Fred, longtime fan. Thank you for doing this. Quick question. With AI being the team of every company today, how do you distinguish between the industries that you'd want to invest in? If all things are equal and it fits into your investment thesis, how can you tell where AI makes the most impact, and how do you allocate these dollars from investment purpose?
You're talking about AI?
Yeah.
Right. We like to think of AI as a tool to go after a market opportunity, not something to invest in and of itself. So how can AI make healthcare better? How can AI education better? How can AI open up new markets, in financial services or, other sectors that we're interested in? So that's the lens that we approach AI from. And then, a lot of it is the domain expertise of the team in that discipline, and also their ability to assemble a really strong team of engineers and data scientists so that are credible, that can actually deliver the goods. But we really come at it from the end application, not the technology.
Totally agree with that. What is the problem that it's solving? The next question comes from Sheila. Go ahead, Sheila. Sheila, you're unmuted, so can you ask your question?
Yes, hi Fred. Thanks so much for your insights. I wanted to know how you think about crypto. Do you think the promise of crypto is still alive? And I just wanted to get to your views on it. I heard you mention crypto as an area of interest.
Yeah, I'm sort of a true believer in crypto, and I think it's just it's taking a lot longer for the technology to get into the mainstream than I thought it would, and I think there's some reasons for that. I think that the technology is not easy to use from a mainstream user's perspective yet, and there's more work that has to be done to make that so. And I also think that founders have had a little bit of a problem finding good use cases for it. But to me, the thing that's so appealing about it is that it opens up potentially a new way of thinking about user data and how users can control their experiences using software. It shifts the balance away from the provider of the software more to the user of the software, and that's sort of something I believed in for a very long time, and I think that will ultimately turn out to be the case. But I wouldn't say that we've cracked the code on crypto yet. I think it's still not mainstream enough, and so the investments we've made some very good investments there, but I think that that their promise has not yet been realized in most cases.
Thanks, Fred. The next question comes from Kensi. Kensi, are you there?
Yes. Hi, my name is Kensi. Thank you so much for your time, Fred. My big question for you is simply around best practices for founder and company reporting. As a venture capitalist, what do you see as best practices, and what do you require of your portfolio companies?
Well, hi, Kensi. We don't require anything, to be honest. I think that what we want each company to do is figure out what works best for them. I think if you're a small company, a weekly email, just kind of highlighting the things that were exciting about the last week and the things that are top priority for this week is a great way to stay connected to your investors. As the company grows, I think the reporting probably becomes a little bit more standardized, and you start to report on KPIs and financial results and key hires. But I don't think there's one way to do it well. I think it has to, I think as like the founder, you set the culture of the company, you decide who your investors are, you decide who your senior leaders are. You can also decide how you want to communicate and how you want to report. And it does, like, I'll give you a good example of this. We thought for a long time that maybe we should show founders how to make board decks. And I've often resisted that. And I was like, why should there be a template that everybody uses for, how they run their board meetings? Because some of the best board meetings I've been part of are run by founders who use very unorthodox ways of doing their board meetings. So again, I think it has to be personal to the founder and the founding team, and work with the way that they like to work and communicate in their style. And when it feels authentic, it's better than when it feels borrowed. So I think asking other founders how they do it and asking your investors what they see is a good way to kind of understand what the possibilities are. And then you should pick something that really works for you, that you can do well.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Kensi. Just a small handful of questions more. Kang, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Can you unmute, please? Kang? Okay, I will try to find and ask that question. Actually, I don't have it, but let me go to the next person, who is Gina. Gina, could you unmute?
She's unmuted, but we can't hear her.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Gina. I'm happy to ask the question.
Okay.
So Fred, this is one that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and we've published some work on this, product-led communities. And what we mean by that, and I'm not sure if that's what Gina meant by that, is where there's a core product that the company builds and a community forms around it, much like eBay or Skillshare. So what are your thoughts on the future of product-led communities? Have you noticed innovative products or trends looking to connect people more meaningfully online and offline?
Look, I think communities, online communities, have been around since the beginning of the internet, and they're not going away. And I think it's a very powerful business model. One of my favorite of our portfolio companies is Stack Overflow, which, for all of you developers out there, I'm sure you know well. And it's really at its core a community of experts sharing their knowledge with everybody else. It's super valuable. It's a great business, and it's a super great product that many people use for free every single day. So I really think that one of the great things about the internet are communities, and there's some new things that are going on, I think, around how communities should be governed and how communities should be monetized, and business models for communities that are interesting to me. So I think, there's still a lot more opportunity there. And it's an area that, I really like and have liked for a long, long time.
All right, Fred, last question from Kang, which again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. How is fundraising today different from 6 months or a year ago? And I would add, actually, it feels like the market's really moved in the past 4 years, especially at the seed and the Series A.
Yeah, I mean, from what we see, founders have lots of options to finance their companies. And, obviously the pandemic has made it harder in some ways, but easier in some ways. It's made it harder because you can't meet people in person. And if that's your secret sauce, that you're the kind of person who can walk into a room and charm everybody, and then then that's going to work against you in this moment. But honestly, it's easier, I think, based on what I see personally, other investors I'm talking to, and founders I'm talking to. It's easier to get on an investor's calendar today than it's ever been, because most investors are working remotely from home. They're not traveling as much. They're probably more available. And, truthfully, a 30-minute Zoom with somebody is a smaller ask than an hour-long face-to-face meeting. And so I think it's easier to get a meeting. I think it might even be a little easier to raise money right now than maybe it was 6 or 12 months ago, but it's not a lot easier. It's not like an order of magnitude change in the market, but I don't think it's harder to raise money right now. That's not what we're seeing anyway.
I totally agree. I do think I'm taking way more meetings because I'm not even, going to the office.
Right.
And this session is case in point, Fred, which, we had over 350 people on the Zoom, many of whom would not have been able to be there in person. And we certainly would not have had you join us all the way in the Bay Area if we didn't, if we weren't in this pandemic. So that's just, despite the great difficulties COVID has caused, this is one small benefit. And thank you so much for an incredible session, Fred. Really so grateful for your making the time and for your, just honesty and just calling it like it is and sharing your thoughts on how you see the world and where things are. Thank you. It was an amazing session for me, and I know for all the founders here. Really appreciate your joining us.